Hi again. Welcome to day 8 of React Holiday. Welcome back. Today is going to be video only, so no email. I try to stay away from my inbox during the weekend, and I wanted to kind of show you some respect by giving you a little bit of a reprieve. Now, I'm still going to make a video because there were a lot of questions, and I wanted to take that opportunity to answer questions to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with the material that we already covered. Now, I'll probably do that for the rest of the weekends as well. We'll see. Now, one of the biggest questions that we had, and what I want to cover today, is about props. Now, there was a lot of things that we did with props, and the biggest question was with regard to spreading props. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about all the things that we're doing with props, and just give certain things some attention and talk about why we do them. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to implement a brand new Pokemon item component from scratch, and so we can talk about some of the oddities and why I ended up writing it the other way first. So we're going to do that. To start, always to start, we got to put the new day in there, and something that you'll end up having to do a lot, that is kind of not intuitive, is that if I want to comment, some React code out in JSX, I have to open up interpolation and use a JavaScript block comment. So that's really the only way to do it. You can't use the inline comments unless you do the interpolation on every line, and so this is the best way to do it. It's cumbersome, yes, but it's the way you gotta do it. So anyway, so I am commenting that out so none of our suspense list stuff is happening. Now, what I wanna do is I just wanna start with some inline H1 element. So, and this isn't semantic, but I'm just doing it to make sure that it's nice and big. So we're going to say the Pokemon. Okay, so all we have right now is we have an H1 element. This is a native DOM element, and it is rendering the text, the Pokemon. Now, as you would expect, when I put an ID on here, some ID and a class name, some class, all of these just work. And I will prove that to you. I'll try not to save too much because it keeps jumping up to the top. So I will prove that to you. We'll go in here, we'll inspect this and see that in fact it has ID, some ID, and class, some class. That's great, okay? That's exactly what we wanted. Now, let's take this and put it inside of a component. So let's call this Pokemon item. Typing is atrocious today. We'll put that up here, function Pokemon item. We're not going to take any props yet, and we will return exactly what we copied before, right? This is multi-line, so we'll have to wrap it in parens like that. And there we go, it works. Now we're applying this ID and class name at the component level, which is a bad idea. It could be fine if you just use class, but an ID, it needs to be unique every time, right? So let's take that off and say that if you want to provide an ID, well, then you would have to provide it here. At the call site where you're using it. So we'll paste that in. And now you'd think that maybe that would pass through. Well, let's check. Now all we're seeing is some class. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, we're applying that some class here, but that's it. Those are all the props that can ever be passed in because we're not allowing the ability to have any other of the native props passed in, right? So in order to solve that, what we do is we would, we would take our props. Remember, that's an object, and it's passed in as the first argument to this function, and we would spread them out. Okay, so we say we use this JSX spread attributes syntax, and it says anything that we get, I want to spread out on this underlying H1 element. Okay, and it doesn't matter what element this is, you just spread them out. It's always gonna work the same. So now we got our ID back. Great, perfect. So that's step number one. That's the reason that we do this kind of this spread props magic. Now there's a little bit of a problem here, and I wasn't able to get Code Sandbox to report this error, so I'm just going to show you what happens. Now let's log out props. Let's see if this works. Maybe logging is just busted in general for me. Okay, cool. So the only prop that we're passing in is ID, okay? Well, sometimes components will define our own props, right? So let's say we said name is going to be, this would be where we say the Pokemon. Okay, now I'll leave this one lowercase so that we can see that when it changes. So name is the Pokemon, and then here, instead of putting the name here, we want to make that customizable, and so we would use props.name. Perfect. So that went to lowercase, so we know that we're getting the value that's being provided in the application side. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing, so when we log out these props, we see ID and name. That's great, but here's what that means. And this is where you have to be careful. Because we are spreading out all of the props that we get, well, name the Pokemon is also getting applied to our element. And that is not an attribute that you can actually put on an H1. Now, in other development environments, I've seen React actually warn about this, saying that you're passing props to a native element that doesn't actually support those. So what do we do? How do we get this off? That is where the destructuring assignment comes in. So destructuring assignment is a way to say, I know what the shape of this object is. I know that props always going to be an object. Okay. Now, what I can do is I can reach in to this object using destructuring assignment, which is basically the opposite of kind of an object literal, and pull off values that I care about. In this case, I want to pull off name. Okay. Well, I'd need a comma there. So name. Now, this right now is effectively the same as what we had before when it was just props. And the reason that is because we're just taking this whole object as props. With destructuring assignment, we have this little ... which means take everything else that I haven't pulled off and put that in a new object called props. Now, in this case, it's the same as it was before. It's still ID and the Pokemon. However, we can, again, use destructuring assignment to pull off name, right? And now all of the things that are left are just ID or anything else that we pass on that is an appropriate attribute. But we're counting for our custom prop that we have for our component. It's part of the API of our component. So now props.name doesn't exist. That's why it's showing nothing, because we've pulled it off of what would be that props object so that we can spread it here without error. And so all we have to do is pull that off, because now it's just we've defined that one property as kind of a variable right here in our component. So we do all that, and that all works again. So one of the questions was, why was I not, why did I have it like this, right? And why wasn't I using children? All right, so let's dive into that. That's another big question. Okay, so a lot of times you might not want to, you might not want an API like this. You might want to kind of apply some class. So let's say this is Pokemon item. That's the class that you want to apply. But really, you also want to give the user of your component control over the children. And what I mean by that is we would say Pokemon item oops, close that up. And here we would say the Pokemon. I'm going to use uppercase again so we can know when it switched. This is more like what we would want, right? So Pokemon, the Pokemon. Now here we can get rid of this name prop now because we're no longer using a name prop. And what we would do typically is we would take the children. Now this is React specific, but basically anything that is inside of this this JSX tag, whether it be more elements or just text or whatever, is going to come in as children. So now instead of name, if we say children, the Pokemon will show. Now here's the cool thing, is that children is just a prop like the other props, right? Go figure. So if I take this off, and I take this off, and I take this off, and I just close that up so it's a self-closing tag, children is one of those props. So when I HTML or H1, I get children by default, and then that spreads that out with the rest of the props on the H1. Crazy, right? So that's something that I do a lot. I mean, it's really just like a syntactic nicety. Just so you don't have to take full control over the children and place it. Yeah, it's just a nice to have, really. So, yeah, so that's the other thing. That's why I do the self-closing with the props spread, and the children just kind of goes on. Next thing. So now we can, if we wanted to do additional class names, so we say class name, my Pokemon, or let's say like app Pokemon. Okay. Again, we are, to like reiterate this point, we are statically saying like this Pokemon item will only ever have the class name Pokemon item, no matter what you give to it. Kind of. So check this out. So if we look at this again, we actually, let's just log our props, because I think we're still doing that. So we see that the props coming in are ID, some ID, class name, app Pokemon, and children, the Pokemon, right? And those all get spread out. Great. Now, what class do you think is going to get applied? What class name do you think is going to get applied onto our element? Think about it for a second while I find it. Okay, so we got app Pokemon, which is crazy, right? We overrode this one. Now, what if we always want this one? Okay, well, we can, spread is order dependent. So if we put this before, oops, if we put this before the class name, well, now Pokemon item is there instead of app Pokemon. But it didn't merge them together. It just said this one's more important because it comes after the other class name. So what do we do if we want them both to show up? Okay, here's where the magic comes in. We're going to take class name off of this props that we are spreading onto our attribute because we need control over that. Okay, then we're going to kind of do some magic here. So we will interpolate this, and we're going to shove it inside of an array. This is the easiest way that I know how to do it. You can use a library like class names to manage this for you, but I'm just going to call join, put a space in between each item in this array, and I'm going to, in the second position, put class name. Okay, that's the one that I've peeled off this. Now props has no more class name in it. I will show that to you here. We've pulled class name out. And let's see. So this is going to be spreading everything but class name. And we'll be defining our own class name, which has this, the one that we always want there, present with the one that is provided from the developer. So fingers crossed, if we got everything right, we should see now that both classes are being applied. Yep, Pokemon item and app Pokemon. So, man, that's a lot for these. But those are kind of all of the things that you really need to know about props. Now, now that we have this, the props, where that placement is, really doesn't matter because we're already pulling that off. So there is no class name to override this one that we got here. So I think that's mostly it. I wanted to show you, I think, one more thing. Now, one question is kind of how these components interact with data. So we have from the API endpoint a number of, let's see, there's a certain shape that a Pokemon has. So let me pull that up. And it's going to look like this. We know that it is always going to be, or not always, for this version of the API, it's going to have a name and a URL. Now, for our Pokemon, let's see. Where is it? So if we wanted to have an API, a component API that mirrored the data that we were going to get, it would look something like this. We would give it name, Pokemon.name, and, or let's see, Bulbasaur, and, oops, man, Bulbasaur, and URL, give that URL, which is the Pokemon at position 1. Then, of course, we would want to kind of reserve children because we're giving it a name. It's going to have opinions about how that name's displayed. Okay. I'm going to save this real quick. It's going to reorient some stuff, but it's getting kind of sloppy. So we have a mix of these kind of DOM element HTML attribute APIs, but then also the APIs of our Pokemon. I'm going to go here one more time to get that. Now, I'm not going to actually pull this from the API, but I am going to demonstrate what this would look like. So let Pokemon equal that. Now, we have name and URL. So let's implement this first. So in this case, because we're no longer letting them control the children, we're going to have to close this up and say what we want is the name in that children position. We're going to do what we've done in the past. We're going to remember, because we're spreading out all of these over the attribute, we need to peel off everything that is part of our specific API. So the name, we're going to pull off the props object, as well as the URL, which will pull off the props object. Okay, again, save this for the formatting. Scroll down. Okay, so that's all looking good. Now, this is great. So we have, name, Bulbasaur, URL. I'm not showing it right now, but I could. Now, what we can do is we can also use JSX spread attributes, not just for the basic HTML element ones, but we can also use them for our API. So Pokemon, we know, is an object. So we can spread out the Pokemon object. Now, again, these are being passed through to fulfill this API of name and URL. And if I want, I can add in that URL here. So now I'm actually done. That is a lot of stuff to learn about props, but that's really kind of everything that you might need to know at this point. Those are things that I use all the time, techniques that I use all the time. So that's it. Yeah, just go have some fun, explore with props, make something awesome, and I will see you tomorrow.